I was sitting at a dinner table with people who had no idea who I really was. And within the next 10 minutes, one decision in that room was about to blow up 2 entire lives. Nobody at that table knew what I did for a living. Nobody knew what I actually earned every single month. Nobody knew the weight I carried, the lives I had been responsible for, the decisions I had made that most people only see in movies. I wanted it that way. I needed it that way. I needed to know something most people never get the chance to find out in their entire lives. How would these people treat me if they believed, with absolute certainty, that I had nothing to offer them at all? So I showed up looking like nothing. I showed up small, quiet, forgettable on purpose. And what happened next, at that table, over that dinner, is the kind of story you do not forget once you've heard it. Because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why I made the choice I made. Why a single piece of paper slid across that table changed the entire trajectory of 2 families. And why the person who thought he was marrying someone beneath him ended up learning the hardest, most humbling lesson of his life in front of the very people who taught it to him. Stay with me through this whole video, all the way to the end, because there are 3 things I am not going to tell you yet, and I promise you, every single one of them matters more than you think right now. First, you are going to want to know exactly what was written on that contract they pushed toward me that night, because it was not what you are picturing in your head right now. It was worse, and more specific, and more revealing about who they really were than they ever intended it to be. Second, you are going to want to know why I never told the man I was about to marry the truth about who I actually was. Even after years of being together, even after he put a ring on my finger, even after I said yes to spending the rest of my life with him. And third, you are going to want to know what happened in the minutes and weeks after they found out the truth, because someone in that room did not survive that night with their pride fully intact. And I promise you, it might not be the person you are expecting right now. Let me take you back to where this whole story actually started, because you need the full picture, every piece of it, before I show you what happened at that table, and before any of it will make complete sense to you. My name doesn't really matter for the purposes of this story, so let's just say I go by my middle name when I am not in uniform, Hale. I was 29 years old when all of this happened, and on paper, my life looked like absolutely nothing special. I rented a small 2-bedroom apartment outside the base, the kind with thin walls and a leaky kitchen faucet I never bothered to report. I drove an old sedan with a dent in the back door that I never fixed, because fixing it would have meant admitting I cared what it looked like. I wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation through the entire winter, washing them on Sunday nights, folding them the same way every time. To anyone who passed me on the street, in the grocery store, at the gas station, I was forgettable, plain, quiet, exactly, precisely how I wanted to be seen. What nobody around me could see, what nobody outside a very small circle was ever allowed to know, was the other half of my life, the half that existed behind a wall I had built so carefully over more than a decade that even I sometimes forgot it was there. I had spent 11 years in the military by that point, starting the day after I turned 18, when most of my friends from high school were picking out dorm room curtains and choosing meal plans, and I was learning how to survive on 4 hours of sleep, how to read a room full of men twice my age and command their respect without raising my voice, how to make decisions under pressure that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. I climbed through the ranks faster than almost anyone in my entire cohort, faster than people twice my age with half my drive. I deployed 3 separate times to places I still don't talk about at dinner parties, places that taught me things about myself I never expected to learn at 22, 24, 26 years old. I made decisions that kept people alive. I made decisions that I still replay at 2 in the morning sometimes, when the apartment is too quiet and the dark gives my mind too much room to wander. By the time I turned 29, I held the rank of Major General, 2 stars sitting on my shoulder whenever I wore the uniform, which, by that point in my life, was almost never outside of work. Because the second I put on that uniform, people stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing only the rank, only the stars, only the authority, and I had grown tired, deeply tired, of being seen that way every single moment of my life. My monthly pay sat around $18,000, not counting allowances, not counting the housing stipend I deliberately chose not to use, because I genuinely preferred my plain, slightly leaky little apartment, not counting the investments I had quietly, patiently built over more than a decade of living significantly below my actual means. I could have bought a house outright, in cash, without blinking. I could have driven literally anything I wanted. Any car, any year, any brand. I chose not to, deliberately, every single day. Because the moment people find out what you have, the moment they learn what you're truly worth, they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as an opportunity, as a resource, as something to be extracted from. I had watched this exact transformation happen to other women I served alongside over the years. The second their rank became public, the second their financial situation became known, the friendships around them changed. The men who suddenly found them interesting changed. Even their own extended families changed, calling more often, asking for things they'd never asked for before. I was not, under any circumstances, going to let that happen to me. I had built my entire personal life around staying invisible, and I had no intention of giving that up easily, not for anyone. That is where Daniel comes into this story. I met him at a small coffee shop 2 blocks from a base I wasn't even stationed at, which tells you right there exactly how careful I was about keeping my 2 separate lives from ever touching each other. He was funny in a dry, understated, almost accidental way, the kind of funny that sneaks up on you instead of announcing itself. He worked as an insurance adjuster, drove a sensible 4-door sedan he was weirdly proud of, and had absolutely no idea, none whatsoever, that the woman he was chatting up over a spilled latte that afternoon outranked nearly everyone he had ever met in his entire life, including his own father, who liked to remind people often that he had built his logistics company from nothing. I liked that he had no idea. I liked it more than I expected to. For the first time in years, somebody was talking to me. Actually, to me, not to the stars on my shoulder, not to the authority in the room, not to what I represented, just to me, Hale, the slightly awkward woman who'd just spilled coffee on his shoe and apologized too many times. We dated for almost 2 full years before he proposed. In that entire stretch of time, I let him believe, completely and without hesitation, that I worked an administrative job on base, paperwork, scheduling, coordinating logistics for people who actually mattered. Nothing glamorous, nothing worth asking too many follow-up questions about. I told him, very early on, that I was a clerk. He never questioned it, not once, because why would he? I dressed plainly when I was with him. I drove my dented sedan to every single one of our dates. I never once mentioned the deployments, never mentioned the medals sitting quietly in a small wooden box at the back of my closet, never mentioned the fact that grown men with families and decades of service, called me ma'am and stood at attention the instant I walked into a room. I built an entire second identity around him, around us, not out of shame, never out of shame, but out of pure self-protection. I wanted somebody, just once in my adult life, to choose me, the actual person, not my paycheck, not my rank, not the version of me that came with influence attached. When he got down on one knee in that same coffee shop where we'd first met, ring trembling slightly in his hand, more nervous than I had ever seen him, I said yes before he even finished the sentence. And for one brief, golden moment, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I had actually found someone who would have loved me exactly the same, whether I was a clerk earning a modest salary or a general earning $18,000 a month. I wanted so badly to believe that. I wanted it more than I had wanted almost anything in years. But some small, stubbornly suspicious part of me, the part 11 years in uniform had trained never to fully relax, never to fully trust a calm room, wondered quietly if I would ever actually get the chance to find out the real answer, or if I would spend the rest of my life simply assuming the best and never truly knowing for certain. That exact suspicion, that small, persistent doubt I couldn't quite silence no matter how many times I told myself I was overthinking it. Lying awake some nights running through every version of how he might react if the truth ever came out, gently, on my own terms, instead of all at once, is precisely why, when Daniel told me his parents wanted to meet me properly over Christmas dinner, I saw an opportunity sitting right in front of me that I knew I could not afford to ignore. He warned me about them before we had even pulled out of my apartment complex's parking lot. He said his mother had very strong opinions about absolutely everything, from the right way to set a table to the right kind of person to bring home for the holidays. He said his father had built a moderately successful logistics company essentially from nothing, starting with 2 trucks and a handshake deal, and never once let anyone in the family forget it, bringing it up at birthdays, at graduations, at funerals. He said they were the kind of family who asked what you did for a living within the first 5 minutes of meeting you, almost as a reflex, and then quietly, almost imperceptibly, recalculated exactly how much attention and warmth you deserved based entirely on your answer. He said all of this half-joking, the way people do when they're trying to soften something that genuinely hurts, but I could hear the real tension underneath every word, the years of quietly being measured against some invisible ruler in his own childhood home, found wanting more often than not. So I made a decision in the car, somewhere on the highway, watching the exits blur past. I was not going to correct anything they assumed about me. I was going to let them believe exactly what Daniel already believed, that I was a quiet, unremarkable clerk with an unremarkable income, an unremarkable car, and an unremarkable, ordinary future ahead of me. I dug out the oldest coat I owned from the back of my closet. A faded gray thing with a broken button I had never once bothered to fix. The kind of coat you wear specifically when you do not want anyone looking at you twice. When you want to disappear a little into a crowded room. I left every piece of jewelry at home except a small, plain ring that meant nothing to anyone but me. I practiced silently in my head on that long drive, being smaller than I actually was, speaking softly instead of with the command voice that came naturally after 11 years, deferring instead of leading, letting silences sit in the air instead of immediately filling them with the easy confidence that defined every other part of my life. I wanted to see, with my own 2 eyes, exactly how a family like that, a family that prized status and appearance and net worth, would treat someone they genuinely believed brought nothing valuable to their table. We pulled up to a house that looked exactly like Daniel had described it would, almost suspiciously exactly. Large, tasteful, immaculately landscaped even in the dead of winter. The kind of home that whispered money instead of shouting it. The kind of restraint that somehow costs more than flash ever could. His mother answered the door wearing pearls and a cream-colored cardigan that probably cost more than my entire winter wardrobe combined. Gave me a smile that was technically a smile but didn't quite reach her eyes, and looked me up and down in under 2 seconds in a way that told me everything I needed to know about how the rest of this evening was likely going to unfold. His father shook my hand with the firm, brief, evaluating grip of a man assessing a business contact rather than meeting his only son's fiancé for the very first time. I smiled back, softly, and let myself shrink a little, disappearing further into that old gray coat with its single broken button. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasting meat, warm and inviting in a way that almost made me forget for a moment why I was really there. There was a fire going in the living room. Stockings hung with what looked like genuine care along the mantel. A tree in the corner decorated in coordinated gold and white ornaments that clearly hadn't been chosen by accident. Everything about that house had been arranged, curated, presented, the same way I imagined Daniel's parents arranged and curated everything in their lives, including, I was about to learn, their opinions of the people their children chose to love. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Almost disarmingly so. Small talk about the drive up, about the unseasonably cold weather, about Daniel's job and how the insurance industry had changed since his Father's Day. His mother poured wine generously, complimented the table settings she herself had arranged, told a long story about a charity gala she'd recently chaired. I nodded along, said little, kept my hands folded politely in my lap the way I had practiced in the car. And then, right on schedule, exactly the way Daniel had predicted on that drive over, his mother turned to me with that same tight, polished smile and asked, almost casually, what I did for work. I told her I handled paperwork and scheduling on base. Administrative support, I said quietly. Nothing exciting, nothing worth dwelling on. I watched her face change in real time, a small, almost imperceptible shift around her eyes, the kind of subtle recalibration Daniel had warned me about on the drive over. His father asked a follow-up question about my salary, phrased just casually enough to seem like polite conversation rather than an interrogation, and I gave him a number low enough to be entirely believable for a junior administrative role. Low enough that I watched it land exactly the way I expected it to. The temperature in that room dropped by several noticeable degrees in that instant, and nobody had to say a single additional word for me to feel it settle over the table like something physical. Daniel tried to redirect the conversation, mentioning something about a project he was working on at the office. And for a few minutes, it almost worked. His mother asked polite, surface-level questions about my family, where I'd grown up, whether my parents were still local. I gave short, honest, but carefully edited answers, mentioning my mother's small house 2 states over, leaving out entirely the part where I'd paid off her mortgage 3 years earlier without ever telling her where the money actually came from. His father refilled his wine glass and steered the conversation toward real estate prices in the area, commenting, almost offhand, that it was remarkable what some people could afford these days on government salaries. A comment that hung in the air just slightly too long, aimed, I suspected, more at me than at anyone else at that table. I noticed the way his mother's eyes kept drifting to my hands, to the simple, plain engagement ring with its modest stone. The kind of ring a junior administrative clerk's fiancé might realistically afford. I noticed the way she glanced, more than once, at my coat still draped over the back of my chair, that faded gray fabric with its single broken button, and I noticed the small, satisfied way the corner of her mouth moved each time, as if every detail confirmed something she had already decided about me before I'd even walked through the front door. I kept my expression soft, slightly uncertain, the expression of someone unaccustomed to rooms like this one. And inside, quietly, I cataloged every single one of those glances, every comment, every recalibration, the way I had once cataloged terrain before a deployment, methodically, without emotion, simply gathering information I would need later. You need to understand, right here, at this exact point in the story, that I am asking you to hold on to 3 things I told you at the very beginning that I was not going to reveal yet. Because we are getting closer now, much closer, to all 3 answers. And what happens in the next part of this story is going to recontextualize absolutely everything you have heard so far, in a way I promise you are not currently expecting. If you are enjoying this story so far, genuinely enjoying it, do me one quick favor before we keep going any further. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because the next part of this is exactly where everything starts to shift, where the real tension begins. And I do not want you to miss a single second of what's coming next. There is a reason I am walking you through every one of these details in order, a reason every small moment matters to the bigger picture. And trust me completely when I tell you that you are going to want to be here, subscribed, ready, for the exact moment it all comes together at that table. As dinner went on, his mother's questions got sharper in a way that was carefully dressed up as polite curiosity, but landed every single time like a small, calculated test. She asked if I had any savings to speak of, any retirement plan beyond whatever the government offered, whether I truly understood the kind of lifestyle Daniel had grown up with and presumably expected to maintain. His father chimed in more than once about how important it was for a family to maintain its standards, gesturing vaguely around the dining room as though the chandelier itself proved his point. I kept my answers short, deliberately vague, carefully unimpressive, watching Daniel grow more and more uncomfortable beside me with every passing question, his jaw tightening, his eyes flicking toward me with something between apology and confusion, like he genuinely couldn't understand why his parents were behaving this way tonight, or why I wasn't pushing back the way he half expected me to. At one point, his mother mentioned, almost in passing, a young woman Daniel had briefly dated years before me, the daughter of a family friend, someone who came from what she called the right kind of background. And I watched Daniel's ears turn slightly red as he muttered something about how that relationship hadn't worked out, for reasons that had nothing to do with money. His mother only smiled and said she was simply making conversation, but the comparison hung in the air anyway, deliberate and unmistakable. a quiet reminder of who I was being measured against and how badly, in her mind, I was currently losing. Then, somewhere between the main course and dessert, his mother excused herself from the table for a moment, mentioning something about needing to grab a folder from the study. The room felt strange while she was gone, charged with an anticipation I couldn't quite name yet, though some old instinct, the same instinct that used to tell me when a briefing was about to go sideways, told me to pay close attention to whatever happened next. She came back holding a manila folder, thick, professionally printed, the kind of document that had clearly been prepared in advance, before I had even walked through their front door, before they had asked me a single real question about who I actually was. She set it down beside my plate without ceremony, the way you might toss a napkin onto a table, and said, in a voice that tried very hard to sound casual and almost succeeded, that since Daniel had clearly made up his mind about marrying me, the family felt it was important to make things official and clear before any wedding planning went any further. I looked down at the folder. Daniel looked down at the folder. For a moment, nobody said anything at all. The only sound in the room, the faint crackle of the fire in the next room, and the soft clink of his father setting down his fork. Inside that folder was a prenuptial agreement, drafted, printed, formatted with a law firm's letterhead at the top of every page, ready and waiting for a signature, outlining in careful legal language exactly what I would and would not be entitled to in the event of a divorce. The language was clinical, precise, clearly written by someone who had handled this exact kind of situation before, structured in a way that made it painfully obvious they assumed I would be the one bringing nothing into this marriage and potentially taking everything out of it. His father explained, in the calm, reasonable tone of a man thoroughly accustomed to people agreeing with him without argument, that this was simply smart business, nothing personal, that he had personally watched plenty of young women marry into money over the years and walk away afterward with far more than they had ever contributed, and that he and his wife only wanted to protect their son's future the way any responsible, sensible family would do for someone they loved. Now, here's something important I have to tell you before we go any further into this story, and I want you to really sit with this one for a second because it matters more than almost anything else I'm going to say in this entire video. You have already made it this far. You have already invested real, genuine time listening to this story unfold. Already curious enough about how this dinner ends that you stuck around instead of clicking away after the first 30 seconds the way most people do with most videos they come across. That tells me something meaningful about you specifically. People who stay through a story like this one, who care enough to want the full, complete picture instead of some rushed, watered-down summary, are exactly the kind of people who end up genuinely loving channels like this one. The kind of people who hit subscribe, not because someone begged them to, not because of some gimmick, but because they recognize, somewhere in the back of their mind, that they're already invested, already engaged, already part of something worth sticking around for. If that sounds like you right now, and honestly, I have a strong feeling it does, go ahead and subscribe before you keep watching, because you've basically already decided, just by being here this long, that you want to be around for whatever comes next. I sat there in my old gray coat with that contract resting in front of me on the white tablecloth, and I felt something settle quietly in my chest that wasn't anger. Not exactly. Not yet. It was clarity. This, finally, was the answer to the question I had come here tonight specifically to find. Not really a question about Daniel, who looked genuinely mortified beside me, who was already starting to stammer some kind of apology under his breath, but a question about the family that had decided, within barely 1 hour of meeting me for the very first time, exactly how much I was worth as a human being, based entirely on a fictional job title and a carefully chosen lie about my income. I want you to sit with that moment for just a second, that image of me at that table, because we are now past the halfway point of this entire story, and everything from here forward is going to start answering the 3 questions I asked you, right at the beginning, to hold on to. What was really written on that contract? Why I never told Daniel the full truth about who I was, and what actually happened in the moments after this family finally found out exactly who they had been sitting across from all evening. I picked up the contract first. I read through it slowly, deliberately, turning each page with the same unhurried calm I once used reviewing operational briefings, while 4 sets of eyes watched me from around that table, probably expecting me to either burst into tears or quietly sign it out of fear of losing the comfortable life Daniel represented to someone they assumed had nothing of her own. Instead, I asked, in the same soft, uncertain voice I had used all evening, whether they happened to have a pen handy. His mother looked almost triumphant for a brief second, sliding one across the white tablecloth toward me with something close to satisfaction in her expression. I uncapped it slowly, and instead of signing where they clearly expected me to, on the dotted line near the bottom of the final page, I turned instead to the very first blank page in the folder, the cover sheet bearing the law firm's letterhead at the top, and I began to write. I wrote my full legal name first, my actual full name, rank included, the kind of name that appears on official orders and award citations, not the casual version Daniel had been introducing me by all evening. Then, underneath it, I wrote my actual occupation, not administrative support, not clerk, but my real title, the one printed on official Department of Defense documents, on the doors of buildings I had walked into where rooms full of grown men and women stood to attention the moment I entered. And beneath that line, I wrote my actual monthly income, the real number, not the modest, forgettable figure I had given them over appetizers an hour earlier, specifically to watch how it would land. I slid the folder back across the table toward them and watched the silence stretch out long enough that I could clearly hear the antique clock ticking somewhere in the next room, each second landing heavier than the last. Daniel picked it up first, his eyes moving slowly across the page, and I watched, almost in slow motion, the exact second understanding hit him. Watched his expression move through confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked unsettlingly close to grief. Grief for the version of me he had genuinely believed he knew for almost 2 entire years. His mother snatched the folder out of his hands to see for herself, and the color drained out of her face so quickly and so completely that for one genuine moment, I worried she might actually need to sit down somewhere. His father read it last, slowly, and to his credit, he was the only one at that table who managed to say something coherent, asking in a voice noticeably smaller and less certain than the one he'd used throughout the entire dinner, whether this was somehow some kind of elaborate joke. It was not a joke. I told them, calmly, evenly, exactly what I had spent nearly 2 years carefully avoiding telling anyone outside a very small, specific circle. My actual rank, 2 stars, Major General, my 11 years of active service, the 3 deployments I rarely spoke about even with people closest to me, the reason I had kept my professional life so deliberately, surgically separate from my personal one for so long. I told them that the quiet clerk they had spent the entire evening quietly, politely humiliating, actually outranked most of the senior officers their son's company regularly contracted with for logistics work, the very contracts his father liked to mention at every family gathering as proof of how far he'd come. I told them that the income they had assumed was barely enough to scrape by on was, in reality, several times larger than the number they'd guessed, carefully invested and grown over more than a decade, specifically so that no one, ever, would be able to glance at me and calculate my worth from the outside based on a car or a coat, or a casual answer over appetizers. I told them I had worn that old gray coat on purpose, deliberately, the same coat now draped uselessly over the back of my chair. I told them I had given them a fake job title on purpose, rehearsed it in the car on the drive over until it felt natural in my mouth. I told them I had done all of it because I genuinely wanted to know, needed to know, before I formally married into this family, exactly how they would treat someone they sincerely believed had nothing meaningful to offer them in return. And now, finally, I had my answer, written in black ink on a prenuptial agreement built entirely on the assumption that I was some kind of opportunist marrying above my station, when in reality, the logistics company his father was so proud of, the one he never let anyone forget he'd built from nothing, was a fraction of the size, in both scale and budget, of the operations and contracts I had personally overseen for years. Daniel's mother tried, almost immediately, to recover some footing, stammering something about how they simply didn't know, as if not knowing somehow excused a legal document sitting between us specifically designed to protect their assets from a woman they'd met for the first time barely 3 hours earlier, as if basic human decency was something you only extended to people whose income you'd already personally verified and approved of. I told her, gently, but without flinching, without softening a single word, that not knowing had been the entire point of tonight, from the very beginning, that this whole evening had never actually been about my rank or my paycheck at its core. It had been about discovering who they truly were underneath the pearls and the wine and the curated dinner conversation, when they sincerely believed I had neither status nor money to offer their family. Daniel didn't say much for a long, heavy moment, sitting very still beside me, his hands flat on the table. When he finally did speak, he didn't rush to defend his parents, didn't offer the easy excuses he could have reached for. He looked at his mother, then slowly at his father, and asked them, in a voice I had genuinely never heard him use before in almost 2 years together, low and unwavering, how exactly they had justified, even to themselves, drafting a legal document specifically designed to protect their assets from a woman they had met for the very first time only hours earlier, before they knew a single, real, true thing about her actual character. His father opened his mouth to answer, closed it again, and for the first time all evening, said absolutely nothing at all. I left that house before dessert was ever served, before the pie his mother had spent the afternoon preparing even made it out of the kitchen. Daniel walked me out to the car himself, his mother calling something after us that neither of us turned around to acknowledge. His father standing silently in the doorway with the porch light casting long shadows across the driveway. Daniel apologized the entire walk to the car, then the entire drive home, his voice cracking slightly somewhere around the highway exit, telling me over and over that he had absolutely no idea, that he was genuinely furious, that this wasn't who he thought his parents were. Or maybe, he admitted quietly, staring straight ahead at the road, maybe it was exactly who they had always been underneath everything, and he simply hadn't wanted to see it clearly until tonight forced him to. I believed him. I could see it plainly in his face under the passing streetlights, in the white-knuckle grip he had on the steering wheel, in the way his jaw kept tightening and releasing like he was replaying the entire dinner on a loop in his head. This wasn't performance, wasn't some practiced damage control. This was a man genuinely watching his own family reveal something ugly and calculated that he had spent years politely, deliberately not looking at too closely, the way you avoid looking directly at something you suspect might hurt to see clearly. We sat in my driveway for almost an hour that night, engine off, heat slowly fading from the vents, just talking. He asked me questions he'd never thought to ask in 2 years together, not because he hadn't cared, but because the version of me he'd known had never given him a reason to ask them. What was it actually like, the deployments? What had I seen? Why had I really chosen to hide all of it from him for so long? Even after the proposal. Even after he'd promised me forever in a coffee shop with a trembling hand and a ring that cost more than he could comfortably afford at the time. I told him the truth, the real truth this time. No editing, no softening. I told him I had been burned before, watched the moment people learned what I was worth change everything about how they treated me, watched friendships shift, watched men suddenly find me fascinating in ways they hadn't 10 minutes earlier. I told him I needed to know, with absolute certainty, that he loved Hale, the slightly awkward woman who spilled coffee on his shoe, and not the rank, not the income, not the stars on a uniform he'd never even seen me wear. He sat with that for a long moment in the quiet dark of the car, then asked, very softly, whether I had ever actually planned on telling him, or whether I would have let him marry me without ever knowing the full truth about who I really was. It was a fair question. It was, honestly, the only question that mattered. In the weeks that followed that dinner, Daniel did something I genuinely had not expected. Something that told me more about his character than 2 years of dating ever fully had. He confronted his parents directly, sat down with them at their kitchen table without me present, and told them plainly that their behavior that night had been unacceptable, completely unacceptable, regardless of whatever my actual job title or income had turned out to be. He made it unmistakably clear that if they could not learn to treat me with basic, ordinary human respect, independent of my net worth, independent of any number on a piece of paper, They would not be a regular, welcome part of our lives moving forward. Not at holidays, not at our wedding, not in whatever came after. His mother tried, more than once over the following weeks, to smooth things over once she fully understood exactly who I was. Suddenly warm in a way that felt brittle and rehearsed. Suddenly deeply curious about my career, my deployments, my opinions on things she'd never once asked about before that dinner. She sent a long, carefully worded email apologizing for any misunderstanding, an email that somehow never quite used the word sorry directly. I let Daniel handle that particular conversation, that particular relationship, because it genuinely wasn't my forgiveness to extend on his behalf, and because I had already learned, with total clarity, everything I truly needed to know about who his parents were underneath the pearls and the wine and the curated holiday table, back when they sincerely believed no one of consequence was watching them closely. I won't pretend those weeks were easy on Daniel either. He told me later, much later, that he barely slept that first week, replaying the dinner over and over, trying to figure out how he had missed so many small signals over the years. Small comments his parents had made about other people, other families, other women who'd married into money. Comments he'd let slide at the time because confronting his own parents had never felt worth the conflict. He said watching it happen to me, watching it happen to someone he actually loved instead of some distant acquaintance, finally made all those old comments impossible to keep excusing. In a strange way, that dinner didn't just reveal his parents to me. It revealed them to him too, fully, for what felt like the first time in his entire adult life. As for the contract itself, the actual document that started all of this, we never signed anything close to what they originally drafted that Christmas night. Daniel and I sat down together, just the two of us, weeks later, and wrote our own agreement entirely from scratch, openly, honestly, item by item, as equal partners who finally, for the first time, knew exactly who the other person actually was, instead of the carefully edited, carefully curated versions we had each been quietly presenting to one another for almost 2 years. There was no lawyer hired by his parents in that room, no assumption baked into the language about who would bring what or take what or deserve what. Just the two of us, at my kitchen table. The same table where I used to eat dinner alone in my old gray coat, figuring out, honestly, what fairness actually looked like between two people who had finally stopped hiding from each other. His father, to his credit, eventually reached out on his own, separately from his wife several months later, and asked if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us. No agenda stated, no warning about what he wanted to discuss. I almost said no, genuinely considered ignoring the message for a few days before responding. But something made me say yes eventually. Maybe curiosity, maybe some old instinct that valued hearing someone out fully even when you owed them nothing at all in return. He didn't apologize exactly, not in so many words, but he did say, somewhat stiffly, that he had spent his entire career building something from nothing and had let that experience make him deeply suspicious of anyone who hadn't done the same, that he'd projected decades of guarded instinct onto a dinner table conversation with someone he'd known for exactly 3 hours, and that in hindsight, knowing what he knew now about my actual career, he recognized how badly he'd misjudged the entire situation. It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't even really a complete one, but it was honest. And coming from him, that counted for something. His mother and I never fully repaired things, not in the way Daniel probably hoped. Quietly, we eventually would over time. We are polite at family gatherings now, cordial, careful with each other in the specific way two people are when they both remember exactly what happened that night, and have simply decided, by unspoken mutual agreement neither of us ever actually voiced out loud, not to bring it up directly again. She knows who I am now, knows the rank, knows the income, knows the years of service she dismissed so quickly over appetizers that night. And I think, somewhere underneath the careful politeness, she also knows that no amount of newfound warmth on her part can fully undo what I saw so clearly in her at that table when she believed I had nothing to offer her family at all. Daniel and I got married the following autumn, a small ceremony, far smaller than his parents would have preferred, with people who actually knew me, the real me, not the carefully constructed clerk I'd invented to survive one specific dinner. Some of the men and women who had once stood at attention when I walked into a room stood instead, that day, simply as friends, in regular clothes, raising regular glasses, watching two people who had finally, fully stopped hiding from each other, promise to keep doing exactly that for the rest of their lives. I wore my old gray coat one more time that year. Not to the wedding itself, but to dinner with Daniel a few weeks beforehand. A quiet, private joke between the two of us by then. A small, private nod to everything that coat had witnessed, and everything it had ultimately revealed about people we both loved in complicated, imperfect ways. He laughed when he saw it hanging by the door, reached over, and finally, gently, fixed that broken button himself with a needle and thread he clearly had no real idea how to use properly. It still looks a little crooked. I have never once considered fixing it again. I think about that dinner often, more often than I probably should admit, even now, years later. Not with anger anymore, not really. That particular sharp edge faded faster than I honestly expected it to back then. Mostly, I think about how close I came to never finding out the truth at all. How easily, how comfortably, I could have simply trusted that everything was fine, signed whatever document was placed in front of me without question, smiled politely through dessert, and spent years afterward quietly wondering whether the warmth I eventually received from that family was ever genuinely real, or simply the predictable product of an income figure I had never once bothered to correct. I think about how rare it actually is, in this life, to get a genuine, unfiltered glimpse of how people treat you when they believe, with total confidence, that you have absolutely nothing to offer them in return. Most people never get that chance. I made mine happen on purpose, in an old gray coat with a broken button, and I have never once regretted it, not for a single day since. People ask me sometimes, when this story comes up, whether I would do it again, knowing everything I know now about how that night ended, about the tension it created, about the months it took for some of those wounds to even begin closing. And every single time, without hesitation, I tell them yes. Not because watching someone's face drain of color over a Christmas dinner table brought me any particular joy. It didn't, not really, even in the moment. But because I genuinely believe, more firmly now than I did before that night, that you cannot build a life with someone, or with their family, on a foundation you have never actually tested. Comfortable assumptions are easy. Untested trust is easy. It costs you nothing right up until the moment it costs you everything. Usually at the worst possible time. Usually when you have the least amount of leverage left to do anything about it. I think about the version of me that almost didn't wear that old gray coat. The version who almost let herself be talked out of the whole idea on the drive over. Who almost decided it was unnecessary, even a little paranoid, to test a family she hadn't even officially joined yet. That version of me would have signed whatever was placed in front of her eventually. Maybe not that exact contract, but some quieter, gentler version of the same underlying assumption, the same quiet belief that she had married up, that she should be grateful, that her worth in that family would always be measured against a number she never had the chance to correct. I am genuinely grateful, every day, that I didn't let myself talk me out of it. I also think, often, more often than I probably admit out loud to anyone, about Daniel in that car afterward, about the particular kind of grief written across his face when he first understood that the woman he loved had been quietly hiding an entire second life from him for almost 2 years straight. I want to be honest with you about something because I think it matters, especially if you've stayed with me this far into the story. That conversation in the driveway wasn't easy. It wasn't some clean, cinematic moment where everything was instantly forgiven and understood. There were real tears that night, real anger, real moments where I genuinely wondered if I had damaged something between us that couldn't fully be repaired, where the very test I designed to protect myself from being hurt by his family ended up, for a few days, hurting the one relationship I actually valued more than any of it: trust. Once you've deliberately withheld it from someone for 2 years, doesn't simply snap back into place the moment the truth comes out. We had to rebuild it slowly, deliberately, the same patient way I'd built my finances, one honest conversation at a time, no shortcuts. What ultimately held us together wasn't the dramatic reveal at that dinner table, as satisfying as that particular moment undeniably was in its own quiet way. It was everything that came after it instead. The unglamorous, ordinary, often tedious work of two people choosing, repeatedly over weeks and months and eventually years, to actually know each other fully instead of settling for comfortably partial versions of each other, the way so many couples quietly do without ever realizing it. Daniel had to reckon, slowly, with the fact that I had hidden something significant from him for a very long time. I had to reckon, in turn, with the fact that my own instinct to protect myself, however understandable it felt from the inside, had cost us both something real in the process, something we couldn't simply get back by deciding to. Neither of us was entirely innocent in how we'd arrived at that Christmas table, and being honest about that, with each other, mattered just as much as anything that happened with his parents. These days, when people find out what I do for a living, when they learn the rank, the income, the years of service tucked quietly behind a fairly ordinary face, I watch for it now, almost reflexively, instinctively. That small recalibration Daniel's mother once wore so plainly and so unmistakably on her face that Christmas night. Most people don't have it in them, or if they do, they manage to hide it far better than she ever did at that table. But every once in a while, in some unguarded moment, I catch it, that flicker, and I think back, every single time, to an old gray coat with a broken button, to a folder slid quietly across a white tablecloth, to the exact moment I learned, with absolute certainty, exactly who I was building a life with, and exactly who I needed to keep carefully at arm's length going forward. If this story made you feel something tonight, whether that was anger on my behalf, or quiet satisfaction watching that contract slide back across the table, or even some discomfort recognizing a version of this in your own family somewhere, I genuinely want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments below, honestly, would you have done what I did? Worn the old coat, told the small lie, tested people before trusting them completely? Or would you have simply told the truth from the very beginning and let the chips fall wherever they landed?